The seminar is about contemporary capitalism and the world of work. I think the most significant feature, perhaps, of contemporary capitalism with regard to the world of work is its total inability to provide work to everybody looking for it. In fact, its inability to provide work to a significant section of the population that is looking for work. Now, this is not just a matter of an economic denial. Of course, the economic denial is very important in terms of the fact that it also has implications in terms of the crime rate, in terms of people's deprivation, hunger, and so on, but also it has very important socio-psychological implications, at least two of which have got to be noted. One is the fact that it actually has resulted in a significant increase in death rates, including in the United States itself, which is the most important advanced capitalist country. In the US, for instance, among white male workers, you now have a death rate which even exceeds what prevailed in Russia after the collapse of communism, and which is quite unprecedented in peacetime anywhere in the world. And many people attribute this to an increase in drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and so on, which is really induced by the loss of self-esteem which arises because of unemployment. There is, of course, a claim that unemployment rate in the US has come down, which by all statistical measures it has, but on the other hand, that coming down appears to be both illusory to an extent, which is obvious from the fact that real wages almost in the entire capitalist world, including the US, are not increasing at all, which would normally be the case in a situation of tightness in the labor market, but also that this reduction in unemployment rate, such as it is likely to be transitory. It's something which is made possible because of Trump's protectionism, which has shifted back a set of activities onto US soil. But on the other hand, when you have retaliation taking place elsewhere in the world, which is waiting in the wings, then you would have this unemployment rate itself going up again compared to what it has been. So the entire capitalist world, advanced capitalist world, including the United States, notwithstanding all appearances to the contrary, is in fact mired in a situation of unemployment. And this has had very important, as I said, implications in terms of loss of self-esteem, death rate, and so on. The second implication of unemployment, which is particularly striking and important for all of us, is that unemployment tends to give rise to a fascist tendency. And this is something which you find all over the world. There is an upsurge of fascism all over the world, including, of course, as you know, in our country. And this is very closely linked to increases in unemployment, as had happened in the 1930s. Typically, situations of unemployment are one in which forces emerge that blame the fact of unemployment not on the working of the system, but on the existence of the other, the immigrants, the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Muslims, the minorities, some hapless minorities of one description or another. And this is something which, of course, many of these groups, which are anti-minority groups, which are supremacist groups, are forever preaching. But this is something which tends to get promoted with the active backing of monopoly capital, of the big capitalists, in situations of unemployment, precisely because their own legitimacy is threatened, and therefore any diversion of attention from putting the blame on the functioning of the system, to putting the blame on the existence of the other, is something which also is useful from their point of view. And as they start backing some of these fascist groups, which always are in existence in any contemporary society, then you find these groups come center stage and acquire political power, and when they do so not on the basis of any agenda, but on the basis of a strong man, the leader, man with 56-inch chest, who can actually take decisive actions against the minorities, and therefore somehow miraculously take people out of their distress and unemployment. But while periods of high unemployment are conducive, therefore, to the growth of all these tendencies and therefore to a disintegration of society, unemployment is not something which exists or is significant only in these periods. In fact, unemployment is a perennial feature of capitalism. And actually one of the most outstanding contributions of Marx was to recognize this fact through his concept of the reserve army of labor, which I consider to be perhaps his greatest contribution to economic theory, the recognition of the necessity and the existence of a reserve army of labor for the functioning of capitalism. The reserve army of labor is necessary for the functioning of capitalism for several reasons, several fundamental reasons. One of these reasons, the most obvious one, of course, is that in the absence of the reserve army of labor, you would not have the possibility of a continuation of the exploitative system. The degree of exploitation would fall. In fact, the surplus value would collapse in the absence of the existence of a reserve army of labor. In fact, this was the argument which was put forward by Joseph Schumpeter against Marx's and Ricardo's theoretical system as well. Schumpeter's argument was that as long as you have profits, and if these profits are in fact invested, and let's for simplicity assume that the workforce is given, then if you have positive profits and the profits are invested, then you would find that the capital stock keeps increasing, the workforce is the same, therefore the capital-labor ratio keeps increasing, and this would go on and on and on and on until the profits disappear, which is something which he called a capital saturation point. So until the profits disappear. So the existence of a reserve army of labor is something which itself would disappear because of the accumulation process, and this in turn would give rise to a situation where real wages would absorb the entire output and the rate of profit would simply be zero. The problem with the Schumpeterian assumption, of course, is that capitalists go on investing no matter what the rate of profit. But if it is the case that capitalists stop investing below a certain acceptable rate of profit, in that case, long before the reserve army of labor has disappeared, you'd actually find that accumulation would have come to a stop, which would recreate the reserve army of labor. Consequently, the existence of a reserve army of labor is something which is essential for a positive degree of exploitation and therefore a positive rate of surplus value. What is more, the existence of a reserve army of labor is also necessary for ensuring a stability in the value of money. Now, capitalism is preeminently a money-using system in which people, of course, hold substantial amounts of wealth in the form of money and, of course, money-denominated assets. Consequently, a stability in the value of money is essential as far as capitalism is concerned for it to function. Now, if you have a world in which you find that we have credit money, as we have in today's world, we don't have gold and so on actually functioning as money, we don't have precious metals functioning as money, but we have a credit money system. In a credit money system, since all wage bargain is in money terms, suppose money wages rise, if a rise in money wages can be passed on in the form of higher prices by the capitalists without money supply being a constraint, then you would actually have a continuation in the price rise which would erode the value of money and make it actually unworthy of being an asset in terms of which wealth can be held. Therefore, the stability of the value of money, the fact that money continues to act as an asset in terms of which wealth is held, and that is a symptom of a money-using economy, which capitalism preeminently is, can only be ensured if there is some stability in the level of money wages. And the stability in the level of money wages comes about because of the existence of a reserve army of labor. The existence of a reserve army of labor also moderates the wage claims which the workers can enforce in money terms, and this plays a very important role in the stability of the value of money. The third very important role of the reserve army of labor is the fact that actually it is what ensures work discipline. Now, work discipline implies, if we are talking about a production system, a modern production system, factory-based production system, you need coordination of activities among all kinds of workers, and this in turn requires a strict imposition of discipline as far as the working class is concerned. Now, the imposition of work discipline, which in a pre-capitalist society would have occurred through the use of the whip, through the use of the Monsignor's whip, is something which cannot be enforced in a capitalist economy in a similar coercive manner, because after all it is an economy in which people apparently voluntarily go to the sphere of circulation and exchange labor power for a certain amount of money, representing a certain amount of claim on commodities, and therefore it's a system based on contract rather than coercion, rather than explicit physical coercion. And if so, then how do you ensure work discipline? You do so by making the threat of unemployment, the threat of the sack, hang over the heads of the workers. What is ensured under feudalism by the threat of physical coercion is enforced in capitalism through the threat of unemployment. The threat of unemployment makes the workers not fall out of line or the operation of the system, but as a matter of fact that's not the case. And Goodwin's model is based on the assumption that capitalism is not a demand constraint system. But once you introduce demand constraint, it is obvious that the process of creation of unemployment is quite different from the functional necessity of the reserve army of labor. In other words, the amount of the actual reserve army is something that can be much greater and is much greater than what is strictly functionally necessary, and what is functionally necessary therefore constitutes a kind of minimum, breaching which brings the accumulation process to a stop, breaching which creates disruption in the accumulation process, but the actual reserve army is far in excess of it. A second phenomenon, which is not at all recognized in economics, but which is really what I want to emphasize, is the following. That when we say, I mentioned earlier about the stability in the value of money. Now, the stability in the value of money requires not just that money wage claims are kept in check, but also we know that all production requires raw materials of various kinds, and a lot of these raw materials are actually produced in outlying regions of the third world, in, for instance, pre-capitalist sectors of the world, or what used to be pre-capitalist sectors of the world upon which capitalism makes an encroachment. Now, if they are produced there, then it's also very important that their prices be kept in check if the stability and the value of money is to be ensured. And this is something which actually is done by having a huge reserve army of labor there, in the midst of which the peasants, the agricultural laborers and so on are located, so that they also are subject to the threat that if they demand higher money wages, then out they go and some other unemployed workers are employed in their place. If they demand higher prices, then of course, or kind of higher shares for themselves, then they are eliminated from the production process. New tenants are taken on and so on. So that the reserve army of labor becomes necessary for this. It becomes necessary also for another reason, which is extremely important, and that reason is the following. So far I have been talking about the stability in the value of money that is ensured by preventing claims from below. But it's quite possible, we know that in capitalism, centralization of capital gives rise to larger profit margins being demanded by the capitalists themselves. Now, any such parametric shift is something which, again, if it is going to be compatible with the stability in the value of money, must mean that there be a group of price takers, must mean that there be a group of people who absorb the larger shares being enforced by the capitalists through their cartel agreements and so on, by being willing to take a cut in their real wages. So the existence of not just a set of people who can't enforce higher money wage claims autonomously, but the existence of a group of people who are actually price takers, in the sense that they are actually at the receiving end. They receive what are the dregs that are left to them after the capitalists have taken their cut and the other organized segments of the population have taken their cut. That is essential for the functioning of the system. By the way, this was something which was recognized even by John Maynard Keynes, who actually thought that the workers constituted such a set because they suffered from money illusion. They were fixated on money wages so that even if prices rose, they could not notice it. Now, that was an absurd psychological explanation for it, but the real explanation for any group of people being price takers is the fact that they are in the midst of a reserve army of labor. From this it follows that actually capitalism has typically always functioned within and requires two distinct reserve armies of labor. One is within the metropolis, where of course it makes sure that the workers are kept in check, their money wage claims are kept in check, consequently their real wages are kept in check, and of course they are disciplined. And the other, which is located far away in the third world countries, as far as the primary producers are concerned, because they too are kept in check by the existence of this reserve army of labor and made to work or made to function as price takers, which therefore introduces stability in the value of money even in the face of parametric shifts. And the point is that economics has traditionally never recognized the reserve army of labor located in the periphery for the essential functioning of capitalism, and also the fact that even in the periphery, the unemployment generated has to be seen quite independently of what is functionally necessary in terms of the reserve army of labor. So the creation of unemployment in the periphery and the existence of a reserve army of labor in the periphery, which is something which occurs under capitalism, which is essential for its functioning, which is a part of its functioning, has not actually been recognized in economics. And it has not been recognized in economics because imperialism is not recognized in economic theory. Now, it must be said that it is not just not recognized in classical political economy, because typically classical political economy operated in a universe which was that of a closed, isolated capitalist economy in which there were workers, there were capitalists, and there was a state that enforced the rules of the game. And that was the universe within which the entire operation of capitalism was analyzed. Marx took over this universe. Of course, classical political economy talked in terms of trade between the different capitalist countries, which basically meant trade between islands, each of which was characterized in this manner by the existence of a group of workers, capitalists, and the state. But on the other hand, that trade had nothing to do with colonial trade, imperialist trade, and so on. That never entered into the analysis of classical political economy. And of course, since Marx took over this universe from Smith and Ricardo, that also does not in any significant way enter even Marx's own analytical framework. Marx was far most extremely sympathetic as far as the colonial question is concerned. He wrote with great insight on the colonial question. His writings on India are tremendous and continue to inspire research to this day. But on the other hand, none of it actually entered into his actual analytical schema. it entered in the discussion of primitive accumulation of capital in volume 1. It entered into discussion of the counteracting tendencies to the falling tendency of the rate of profit in volume 3, and it figured in numerous places in his general writings, taking all 3 volumes of Capital together. But it never essentially entered his analytical schema. The fact in particular, not the impact of colonialism on the colonized economy, that he discussed with great insight, but the impact of colonialism on the colonizing economy, how it was essential or how it was integrated, linked to the process of capital accumulation, is something that really did not enter Marx's analytical schema. Now, it, of course, was therefore a major lacuna in Marx's theory, which for the first time was pointed out and overcome in the writings of Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg was the first to argue that in fact you cannot conceive of the process of capital accumulation without looking at the relationship between the capitalist and the pre-capitalist sectors. Luxemburg's own argument had several problems with it, which were later on rectified when Mikhail Kalecki took over that argument and refined it. But one of the problems with Luxemburg's argument was that she actually saw this process of encroachment by capitalism on the pre-capitalist sector as a process of assimilation. That basically capitalism simply grew everywhere. That the process of encroachment was really part of a process of expansion growth of capitalism. The fact that you can actually have encroachment giving rise to the perennial existence of a degraded pre-capitalist sector is something which really was not analyzed by her, though there are stray references, recognition of this fact in Luxemburg's writing, but that was not really central to her argument. She was actually talking in terms of an expansion of capitalism, encroaches the pre-capitalist sector, but on the other hand, in the process also assimilates the pre-capitalist sector and keeps expanding. As a result, one very important implication of this was the fact that the role of anti-colonial struggle as a part of the struggle against imperialism and therefore a part of world revolution is something that was not theorized by her. In fact, because capitalism, while encroaching on pre-capitalist sectors, was assimilating them, then the only revolution that was seen was a proletarian revolution. Okay? But the idea of an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolution, anti-imperialist struggle really came with Lenin. And Lenin was remarkable for integrating the two strands of the revolution, proletarian revolution on the one hand, in countries in which capitalism has developed sufficiently, and a democratic proletariat-led revolution which is anti-imperialist, which is anti-feudal, in countries in which capitalism has not developed sufficiently, and that going on through stages towards socialism, and therefore these two revolutions being two different props of the process of world revolution is something which was introduced by Lenin. The Communist International was the first organization, unlike the first international in Marx's time or the second international which existed in Kautsky's, of which Kautsky was the undisputed leader. The Communist International was the first international in which delegates from the US, from Germany, from France, from Britain, hobnobbed with delegates from Vietnam, from India, from Egypt, from China and others. It was the first to be integrated into the Marxian framework. And Lenin did it in a very rough and ready manner by simply taking over the work that existed at that time, work essentially of Hilferding and Hobson, which really was specific to a particular conjuncture in capitalism, and then he took it over, incorporated into Marxism, and of course thereby created a certain ad hoc theoretical structure that sustained this view of the world revolution and his view of a democratic revolution in the third world being simultaneously possible historically at a time of proletarian revolution in the first world. But of course, this again did not amount to overcoming the basic lacuna that existed in the structure of Marxism itself. And that lacuna is something which was a lacuna relating to the absence of a theory of imperialism that would see imperialism as being related to the process of capital accumulation in all the phases of capitalism, not just in one particular phase, not just in the monopoly phase of capitalism, but in all the different phases of capitalism. Now, as a matter of fact, imperialism is necessary, essential for the functioning of capitalism. It is so for at least two very basic reasons, theoretically necessary, two very basic reasons, which of course have not been recognized, as I said, in economic theory. Not only have they not been recognized even in Marxist theory, or recognized perhaps but not theorized even in Marxist theory, but they certainly do not figure in contemporary mainstream economics. The fact that the most prevalent growth theory, which everybody, I'm sure, who is a student of economics has been taught, is a theory that actually says that the process of accumulation is limited by the availability or by the rate of growth of the workforce internal to the capitalism. Nothing could be a travesty of truth to a greater extent than this. 20 million slaves were taken from Africa. 50 million Indian and Chinese indentured workers were taken in the 19th century. Capitalism has moved millions of people across the globe in order to meet its labor requirement. In the midst of that, to say that the process of capital accumulation is limited by the natural rate of growth of workforce within the capitalist sector is in fact a travesty of truth, and the fact that well-meaning social democratic economists like Robert Solow or Thomas Piketty say this is really indicative of the degree to which economic theory has totally ignored the fact of imperialism. Imperialism, as I said, is necessary for at least two very obvious reasons. The first, of course, is something that, as I said, was emphasized by Rosa Luxemburg, later on refined by Kaleski, and that was the following. Kaleski argued, following Rosa Luxemburg, that, he drew a distinction between, I don't think he himself used these terms, between what one may say exogenous stimuli for capital accumulation and endogenous stimuli for capital accumulation. And the distinction was as follows. Suppose we have an economy in which capital is accumulating. Growth is occurring. If growth is occurring, then everybody expects that growth is going to occur. When everybody expects growth is going to occur, people make investments because they know markets are going to grow. When they make investments, growth actually occurs. Now that is the endogenous stimulus. In other words, something whereby the system continues to grow because it has been growing. Exogenous stimulus is one where there are some other factors that actually ensure that investment takes place independent of whether growth has been occurring or not. They have to be from outside of this system. Now, it is obvious that endogenous stimuli cannot really explain capital accumulation on a sustained basis. And Rosa Luxemburg's argument can be reinterpreted and has been reinterpreted as really being a prescient understanding of this particular fact, that she was really talking about the need for exogenous stimuli for capitalism to develop. Now, endogenous stimuli, because you can see that if growth is occurring, it will continue to occur. But if growth is not occurring, if for some reason system gets into a zero growth phase, then it would remain perpetually in a zero growth stage. Obviously, you can have therefore not an explanation of sustained growth through endogenous stimuli alone. Therefore, exogenous stimuli are important. Typically, again, the discussion has been that innovations provide this major exogenous stimulus, but there's a whole theoretical tradition which challenges this, because innovations are not really genuinely exogenous, because innovations also tend to get actually introduced in periods when the markets are growing. In periods of stagnation, people tend to go slow in introducing innovation, in which case there would not be an exogenous stimulus. As a matter of fact, many people have argued, including Arthur Lewis, that the interwar period of stagnation in capitalism was a period in which major innovations remained unintroduced. They got introduced in the post-war period as part of the scientific and technical revolution. And why did they remain unintroduced? Because the world economy was stagnant, because the world economy was suffering from the Great Depression. So innovations which are typically considered to be the main exogenous stimulus really are not exogenous. They are more or less quasi-endogenous. Therefore, the only two possible exogenous stimuli you can think of are encroachments into the pre-capitalist market, as Rosa Luxemburg had recognized, and of course state intervention, state spending. State spending is something which can provide such a stimulus only if state spending is financed either by taxes on capitalists or by borrowing. If state spending is financed by taxes on workers, then there's no additional demand that is being generated, because the workers themselves, after all, whatever is taxed away, they would have spent it anyway. So there is a mistake in Rosa Luxemburg where she argues that even taxes on workers can enlarge demand, but that's a mistake. So the point is that state spending, either taxed by taxes on capitalists, financed by taxes on capitalists, or financed by borrowing, can be a genuine exogenous stimulus. But these are both things which capitalists always oppose. Why they oppose this is really a million-dollar question in economics, and I suspect they oppose it because of the fact that it undermines the legitimacy, social legitimacy of having a class of capitalists. Because after all, if the state is required for stimulating the economy, why do we need these fellows? So they're always afraid that it would undermine the social legitimacy of capitalism, and that's one reason why. Of course, they would always be opposed to taxation of capitalists, that's not surprising, but borrowing financed government spending is something which they would oppose to, because it's something which undermines, as I said, the social legitimacy of capitalism. And this fact of the opposition is so obvious that in virtually every country of the world, with the exception of the United States, you now have fiscal responsibility legislation, which is symptomatic of this. In India, for instance, 3% of the GDP is the most that the central government can spend, 3% is more than the states can spend. All over Europe, 3% of GDP is what is the government can spend as fiscal deficit. So, state intervention, which in a certain period which Keynes had advocated, and which in a certain period of existential crisis of capitalism in the post-war years, got introduced into the functioning of the system, and introduced with great success, because it produced what is called the golden age of capitalism by many, is something which once more, with the reassertion of the strength of finance capital in the current phase of globalization, has been pushed to the background. The point to make, however, is that encroachments into the pre-capitalist markets, which of course have their limits, and these limits have been reached. And in my view, the Great Depression of the 1930s was the result of the limits being reached as far as encroachments into the pre-capitalist markets are concerned. Imperialism, in terms of control over these markets, access to these markets, becomes essential for the functioning of capitalism for this particular reason. And this, of course, gives rise to the generation of unemployment there. Naturally, if you have a situation where capitalist products are taking away markets from local producers, then this basically implies that the displaced petty producers become unemployed. And therefore, generation of unemployment is something which is an essential product of this. Many economic historians have argued that the origin of modern mass poverty in countries like India really lies in this process of deindustrialization, on which Professor Bagchi has done the most pioneering work compared to anybody else in the world, including making estimates of deindustrialization in a very careful manner. But the fact that there is generation of unemployment within the third world, within the periphery, because of this encroachment by capital, is something which is not just a happenstance. It's not something that just happens accidentally because you displace more people than you can absorb. I want to argue that this is something which again is a very important characteristic of capitalism. And in order to understand this, I now move to a discussion of the second role that imperialism plays, and that is the fact that there is a whole range of products produced outside of the metropolis, outside of the capitalist sector, which are required within the capitalist sector. Again, Rosa Luxemburg recognized that fact. Now, these products, many of them are in fact produced in the tropical and semi-tropical regions of the world. They are essential for capitalist production, but they cannot be produced in areas where capitalist production prevails. They really require production, or they require imports from areas in which they are produced, which are typically the tropical and semi-tropical regions of the world. Now, the tropical and semi-tropical regions of the world have a fixed land mass. And if they have a fixed land mass, then of course in the absence of land augmenting technological progress, since much of this land mass is in these regions themselves. Therefore, there are two ways that capital accumulation, which increases the demand for this whole range of goods, can actually satisfy this increased demand. One is through land augmentation, and the other is by really squeezing the absorption of these goods inside these regions themselves. Now, land augmentation is of course possible. Land augmentation, however, has this peculiar property that it actually requires state intervention. Again, Marx had mentioned this in a famous letter in which he said that in Asian countries you really have three departments of the state. One is the department that squeezes, extracts revenue domestically. The other is the Department of War that extracts revenue from outside. And the third is the Department of Irrigation. Irrigation is the most obvious common land augmentation measure, and the importance of irrigation was recognized by Marx, and the importance of state involvement in irrigation, on the basis of which a German communist and ex-communist called Karl Wittfogel developed a bizarre theory of Oriental despotism, in which, according to him, actually Oriental societies were characterized by despotism because it required large empires to manage these irrigation works. Anyway, which Professor Van Brief has really criticized very, very, very powerfully. But the point is that state intervention, however, exactly as I mentioned earlier, is something which is eschewed because excessive activism on the part of the state is something which undermines the legitimacy of the system and is something which is undermined, which is therefore avoided. Again, the entire colonial period, as Professor Bakshi has pointed out, with the exception of the Punjab Canal colonies, there were really hardly any major irrigation works that were ever carried out anywhere within the British Empire on any large scale. So if land augmentation is out, in that case, the only main means through which capital accumulation, the needs of capital accumulation, which set a greater demand for products of the tropical and subtropical regions, is met, is through a greater squeeze of the absorption of these goods inside these countries. Now, if you have a greater squeeze, then that greater squeeze must really require, assuming the squeeze is not imposed selectively on one particular group, that would really require a real income compression as far as this population is concerned. Now, this real income compression is one with which is associated the growth of a huge reserve army of labor as far as these countries are concerned. Typically, when we discuss in economic theory, we draw a distinction between the employed and the unemployed, between the active army and the reserve army, as if the unemployed are wholly unemployed and the employed are wholly employed. That's not the case, obviously. What we have is part-time employment, semi-employment, casual employment, part-time, intermittent employment and so on. Therefore, we have a situation where the distinction between employment and unemployment is not stark. The distinction between the active and the reserve army of labor is not stark either. Because of which a suggestion has been made that really one useful way of looking at unemployment or employment or the tightness of the labor market is to start with a base wage rate, real wage rate, and to find out is the proportion of the working population that is below this base real wage rate increasing over time or diminishing over time. If that proportion is increasing over time, then of course you find that the labor market is being characterized by growing unemployment. If it is diminishing over time, then you can argue the labor market is being characterized by growing tightness. Now, a consequence of what I have been talking about, namely with capital accumulation, the demand for all kinds of products from tropical and subtropical regions. Much of the third world is located within the tropical and subtropical regions. The demand for the tropical and subtropical regions' products increases. This demand has to be met through a squeeze in the absorption within these regions themselves, and this squeeze in turn implies that at any given base real wage or real income, per capita income of the working population, the proportion falling below this is something that keeps increasing over time. Therefore, you have a notion of a reserve army of labor existing in societies like ours, which, if you like, is the counterpart of a process of primitive accumulation of capital that continues throughout the history of capitalism. Now, this process of the reserve army of labor is sui generis. It is not related only to the fact of unemployment being generated through the import of metropolitan goods, but it is something which arises because of this phenomenon of squeeze on real incomes. The instruments of this squeeze through which it is exercised, I would not like to go into here. Colonial taxation system was a very important instrument. Deindustrialization was a very important instrument. Neoliberal demand deflation is a very important instrument to this context, but this is something which characterizes capitalism in all its phases. Now, if this is the case, the last point I want to make is the following. One of the deep insights that Marx actually had was that capital accumulation produces wealth at one pole and poverty at another. Now, of course, since Marx has always been visualized, including by Marxists, as basically talking about an isolated, closed capitalist economy belonging more or less located in the metropolis, this has created a lot of embarrassment for the Marxists, because obviously, you can say, look at the increase in the standard of living that has taken place among European workers and so on. So what is this business about poverty at one pole and growth at another? And typically, three kinds of formulae have been adopted in order to actually defend Marxian proposition. One formula is to say that, listen, this business about poverty, Marx had used the term misery. This misery doesn't only refer to material deprivation, it refers to coercion, it refers to alienation, it refers to general degradation that the workers face and so on. So it is a much wider category than simply material deprivation, and in that sense Marx was right. The second mechanism which has been used to defend this is to say that, look, Marx was really not talking about absolute misery, absolute immiserization. He was talking about relative immiserization, and therefore, if you find that really speaking, relatively speaking, the working class has done worse, then that is really a vindication of what Marx was talking about. And the third has been to say that, look, when the active army increases, so does the reserve army, because a certain minimum size of the reserve army is necessary. And this misery and poverty afflicts the reserve army. And therefore, in absolute numbers, the number of people afflicted by misery and poverty and so on is of course growing as capital accumulation grows. Now these have been various ways of defending Marx's insight while remaining confined to a world in which we are really looking at an isolated